Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of our Rate of Rise series. After a little bit of a hiatus, we are back in 2025, and I am so excited to be presenting these roasting-focused episodes for you here on the Keys to the Shop podcast. I know so many of you have missed these episodes, so I'm excited to bring them back. This season of Rate of Rise is brought to you by our friends at Mill City Roasters. You can check them out at millcityroasters.com. They produce fantastic equipment for roasting. They are very, very personable, attentive to your needs with all sorts of information and technical support in their entire product line. They host amazing classes. I've got my certificate behind me here in the office/studio of Keys to the Shop. I got the privilege of being in their Roasting 101 class. Super impressed with the practical application of knowledge and the kind of interactions that they have with their clients, either over the phone or in person in these classes. Whenever you're interacting with them, or Coffee Fest, at the roasting classes they conduct there, you're going to find out why they are kind of a whole different league of advocate for great coffee roasting and profitable coffee roasting businesses. And they're there to support you along the way. So go check them out at millcityroasters.com. You'll really be glad you did. Well, okay, everybody. Today we are going to launch our new season of Rate of Rise by talking about something that I've wanted to talk about for quite a long time, and that is to pre-blend your green or not. Pre-blend your green for your blends, of course. So the title says it all. It's pre-blending versus post-roast. I've worked for a lot of people who have done a lot of pre-blending, but I've also worked for people doing post-roast blending. And so I wanted to talk to somebody who is going to be able to educate us on this. And no better person could I think of than Bryant Banker-Scannell, who has helped launch so many different coffee roaster careers, hundreds of new roasters through his work as the lead roasting instructor at the Mill City Roasters headquarters at their in-house roastery. He also operates and owns his own roasting company called Relative Coffee Company, delicious coffee. I've had at least a couple of their different selections, which combines his passion with roasting and design and photography to create a fun and tasty coffee brand. So Bryant is based in Minneapolis, and he's been roasting for 11 years. He's been in the roasting industry at various capacities for 11 years. And with over a decade of roasting experience, he believes that coffee should be fun and approachable and unique to your experience in the industry. And so it's this kind of level-headed and celebratory perspective toward roasting and the industry that really gives me confidence, along with his technical abilities and prowess, that Bryant is going to be able to help us through the conversation of what is the good and the bad, the ins and the outs of pre-blending your green coffee or doing your blending post-roast. We're not only going to talk about this from the perspective of one versus the other, but just about blends in general and how we should be thinking about maybe some of the marketing around blends, the advantages. So we're going to get very philosophical and very practical about the pre-blending and post-roast and blending in general. And so I'm excited for this episode because it's been on my mind. It's been on my list of topics to just cover on this show. And I'm so glad to get to sit down with Bryant to talk about this. And he does such a fantastic job. So get ready to learn a lot. Here now is my conversation about pre-blending versus post-roast with Bryant Banker-Scannell. Bryant, wonderful to have you on the show. Welcome to Keys to the Shop.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure if you and I met before this, but I was privileged enough to go through a Roasting 101 class at Mill City a few months back. I got to know you a little bit there, and then I got to try some of your coffee at home, and it was so fantastic. And I really, when I see you teach people about coffee, and that's one of the things I appreciate about what Mill City offers with education is like your style of producing content for like live in person sessions is based in such a well, I don't want to say reality, I suppose, like because you know what it's like to be a roaster. You run your own roastery. You've been in the space for 11 years of roasting. Um, and so it comes out in the way you talk. It comes out in the coffee. And I thought there's no better person to talk about today's subject than you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there that we're kind of like teaching based in like reality, and I think it's such a real thing in coffee. You kind of have to like take yourself out from the like hyper focus of it, or the that everything's a critical moment, and just kind of like, this is what coffee is. This is how we roast, and kind of like take the emotionality out of it and kind of like step into like reality a little bit. Yeah,
I like that because you do get into this for a passion, and I would dare say that every person that sits in the seat of learning at these classes, and yourself included, which we'll get to here, started with this idea of passion. But there's like this ebb and a flow of growth through a dispassionate pursuit of knowledge, and then a passionate application of it, I suppose. Um,
for
but
sure.
yeah, I appreciate that. So, well, let's talk about that because you've been in the roasting space for quite a long time. But before that, you were in coffee doing barista work, or how did this all start for you?
It was one of those, I feel like a lot of folks, like, you get your first cafe job, whether it's college campus, Target, Starbucks, or, you know, it's your high school job.
Yeah.
And then you experience something where you're like, oh, this coffee tasted incredible. Why did it taste incredible? And I think for myself, that was intelligentsia, I think back in like, the early 2010s. And I was just like, whoa, but it was just a mocha to start because I wasn't like full on into just like, oh, like coffee for coffee's sake. And it just kind of like spiraled from there where you're just pulling that thread and looking for knowledge of like, why does it taste this way? How can we get coffee to taste this way? Why does it not taste this way where I'm currently at? And like, how can I grow into that space? And so that was like a constant hunt for me where I was with Caribou Training Cafe where they would like train all of their assistant managers and their managers in Golden Valley, Minnesota for a bit. And then I did the whole Target Starbucks route, and I just couldn't get hired at a specialty cafe because I had no experience with manual equipment. And
Hmm.
I and I was like, well, I can't get experience with manual equipment. And so it was kind of trying to find like where I could pocket in. And out of all places, it was the airport. I know it was the concepts when, when all the airports like started like, pushing out all the chains and like the Cisco kind of like branded like
Yeah.
things, and they were trying to bring in local concepts.
Mm-hmm. I
When
remember that.
that first started in the Delta Concourse in Minneapolis, there was a cafe there that was serving Spy House a little bit. They were serving Dogwood Coffee a little bit, and then they also had, I believe it was Cafe Vita as well.
Oh,
And so their whole thing was like, well, let's have one brand that's at all the cafes around the country where we do this concept, and then let's bring in one local brand as like a rotation. And no one wanted to get to the airport at 3 or 4 a.m. So
yeah.
I was like, well, I'll do it if you give me a job. And so that's what got me into like the specialty cafe space because they had a three group Sinessa there. They had what is it? They had Mazers for their espresso grinders. And for me coming into the space, I was just like, how do you use any of this? And it was weeks of just having my phone on the group head at the timer, just like propped there with videos of like latte art and pouring and, nonstop airport lines. That's how I learned quick.
I love that. Yes. So that was just this crucible of learning for you. And I tell you, yeah, I've worked, and this airport gig, is very, very difficult. So
Yes.
anyone out there who's like opening the airport and then having this pressing line of very disgruntled customers,
Yeah.
it is hats off to you. But so you cut your chops, you cut your teeth there in this airport, and now you're a curious individual. You're trying to find all the whys behind the things you love about coffee, but you got into the roasting space as a result of that, I imagine, after learning all you could and becoming one with the equipment and the background of why these flavors came out the way they did. And I imagine that was kind of a very it's either a magical moment or I don't know how you would describe it where you started to affect that flavor yourself in the processing of the green coffee.
Yeah. Yeah, because that really, that kind of like kickstarted my segue into like the cafes outside of the airport with that experience. And it was a series of like right place, right time, which I think is a very like common story, like amongst folks from like cafe spaces that move up into like warehouse spaces. I feel
Hmm.
like if you're lucky enough and you stick it out enough, it's like you kind of just get put in these positions for like I don't want to say better or worse, but it's kind of like, luck of the draw. So I feel very fortunate and like lucky to like have been in those spaces like every time an opportunity has come around. So when I left the airport, I went to a restaurant, my first restaurant gig ever. They were serving dogwood coffee and they were doing gastronomy pub style food.
Mm.
It was a very interesting mesh, and they were a partnership in the city where it was like the restaurant, the coffee, and a bakery in town. So they were like a trio of businesses. And when I found out that restaurant life and culture just like wasn't my speed,
Wow.
I was like, well, I think I'm gonna try going back to the airport, back to just doing coffee. They still had their program there. I was interested in going back, and they were like, "Well, think about what you would need to stay and let us know after the weekend." So I did, and I didn't even get a chance to say my part. I just got in, and they were like, "We have an idea." And the idea was that I would go down to this neighborhood cafe in South Minneapolis, that was a more quaint restaurant concept, still with the coffee and bakery, but
Hmm.
that I would go down there and kind of like help them out. And to make a long story short, that partnership broke up eventually. And then I was locked in on the coffee side. So I kind of got like stuck on the coffee branch of the company. And that's where I was like, oh, like I've kind of like gotten into a spot where I get to do what I love. I get to like do coffee, make syrups, and just keep on keeping on. And eventually, like my manager left and went somewhere else, and they're like, "Well, do you want to be manager?" And I was like, "Sure, why not? I'll give it a go." And then that for a few years, and then our roaster left because they were going into a career that was more suited towards what they went to college for.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
I was like, absolutely, I want to learn how to roast. And so I would go up to roast by day, 9 to 2, like every morning, Monday through Friday. And then I would go to the shop 2 to 10, and I would close the shop every night because I was like, I like, this is the path I want to do.
Yeah.
And I want,
I
and I
like that.
want to show that I want to do it as much as possible.
Yeah. You're just like, coffee, take me,
Yeah,
all of me.
please, please.
And so this is they kind of abandon, I think, a lot of the younger versions of ourselves, those who are a little bit more far along in the industry have identified with the things that we say yes to in order to gain the skills. And now you're in this for so many years with a well developed arsenal of tools and understanding, and I would say wisdom, because initially you're still in that discovery phase and collecting a lot of, well, if I do this, this happens, but if I change another variable, it just confounds me. Now I need to go back to the drawing board. It feels
Yeah.
like there's a bunch of different like cycles like that happen in the roasting process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like that's the same with like, cafe baristas and dialing in, like espresso or brew recipes, you're kind of pushing one way or the other.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of really helps with the thinking of roasting too, because there's so many, unknowns. And, the best that we have is kind of like, it's everything is not to say the word of my brand, but everything is like relative. So it's
Yeah.
like in comparison to one another, and you can't really move the needle unless you have something to go off of and compare to. So, and that's really what it is about roasting. And I think especially too with, coffee blending, like there's a lot of aspects in coffee blending where, I don't know if this is going to work well together, but I have this history of knowing this works well.
Yeah.
Whether that be a ratio or whether that be an origin, you kind of just keep pulling at the thread of what you know until you run into a roadblock. And then you're like, well, maybe I should try something different.
You're weighing a lot of different things here, which is you want to replicate something that is good, but then if you're going to deviate from that, you don't want to deviate down. You want to make it better than the thing that you love that coffee you tasted. I want to do that, but then I want to surpass it. So weighing the risk when it comes to something like blending, to get a little bit into this topic, is
Yeah.
we all know blends. Well, I hope we all know that blends are really great. I
Yes.
think there was a time of where we all like went to discover ourselves on some kind of a sojourn of blends are bad,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. I
We're,
believe. Yep.
you're all like coffee trust fund kids that went to Bali to pretend for a second that the blends weren't good. But now we're back and we think, yeah, I love blends and there's a lot of art, there's a science to it, but there's also a bit of this risk mitigation that comes with it that is sometimes in tension with the artisanal, if you will, nature of coffee,
Yeah.
where we feel kind of dirty thinking about sometimes. Maybe if you're the roastery owner, you don't necessarily, but if you're the roaster, maybe you do. Am I trying to be more efficient? Am I trying to be risk averse? Am I trying to make the best possible coffee I can? So I would like to throw this to you and say, when it comes to the idea of blends, just starting with the idea of a blend itself, what's your philosophy on a coffee blend, the redeeming quality of it for the industry? Or maybe there's another aspect that's a little bit not redeeming.
Yeah. Yeah. I think blends, first and foremost, I think they're like a creative expression, right? They're kind of, you know, they're a hallmark to either the brand or a person or an idea.
Hmm.
And a lot of times, personally for me, it's like your espresso blend or your house blend. Those are kind of like alluding to like your style, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of just get this like really, zoomed out version of like a company by, looking at its blends and trying those first. And then you kind of keep zooming in on, the finer things like your anaerobic, cold, flash pressed, fruit pitched maceration coffees, things like that. Really crazy things. But when creating a blend, I think, the goal is to always create something that is better than the sum of its parts,
Mm.
right? You have this great solid Brazil that's just like chocolatey and nutty. You have this great Colombia that offers, a little bit of body and sweetness and acidity, but it's not, really defined as like, oh, it's lychee or oh, it's this crazy fruit note. It's just like, no, it's just really great sweetness, acidity of body.
Yeah.
And then maybe you have this like washed Ethiopia that, just bergamot tea like. But together, like a cocktail, you have all these aspects that just like make it livelier, more interesting than they are on their own. And they complement each other is always the hope, at least. There's in the past, I know there's been, in the traditional kind of like blending when folks used to do, or I guess I shouldn't say traditional blending, but if you ever had a black and tan like coffee blend,
Hmm.
it's very like, okay, it's like really dark roasted coffee and really light roasted coffee.
Yeah.
But the dark roast is so much more soluble than the light roast. You're really getting that dark roast dominating all of those more delicate light roast characteristics. So it's like, are we making something better than like what's there? Or maybe this is just better as a medium to dark roast kind of blend to find something in the middle, which also improves solubility and the life of homebrewers and baristas.
Well, it kind of makes it its way to this concept of, well, the omni roast and the idea that we will create versatility so that all people who can enjoy coffee can enjoy this coffee.
Mm-hmm.
While the other philosophy might say, we want to maximize the potential of this coffee by itself. But then you run into this black and tan idea, which I had actually never heard to it, heard it referred to as a black and tan. But
Yeah.
I always get worried when I see it, honestly, because I know each one of those at a certain level feels like it must need an environment for ideal expression. Um, because in my water is one temperature when I'm brewing it. I'm grinding it at one size. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that idea of an omni roast versus bringing out the individual characteristics of a coffee, even if it's going to be blended?
Yeah. Yeah. I think thinking about it in terms of like, I guess, what do you need for maybe the business
Mm,
or like the cafe? Because, I think we do a lot of this for our customer. We always want to, treat them the best we can. Great coffee, great experience. Have a good time. Please come back. But when it comes to, I guess, Omni Roast versus one being on its own, roasting on its own, I think you can kind of like maximize a lot of your offerings. So like let's say smaller roasters essentially. So like let's talk about somebody maybe on like a small 1 pound, 2 pound coffee roaster. If you're roasting all of those coffees individually to kind of like their best representation, you have, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 coffees that are like, these taste incredible. But then you blend them together and you're like, this is going to be my house blend.
hmm
So now you've just kind of like maximized your offerings overall. So in that sense, it's kind of like, okay, no skin off your teeth. Is that the saying? Skin off your back?
A skin off of anywhere is probably bad. So I think it
That's
works.
true. Uh, no pressure on you then. Analogies are not quite coming to me right now, but essentially, if a blend is maybe a bigger seller as a smaller roaster, it's like you have like less stake in being like, oh, I have to roast these single origin lots and then have extra left over that I don't know what to do with.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the point of like not omni roasting and roasting specifically for a coffee, I think is much more beneficial. Whereas when you start getting into like omni and like pre-blending, I always like the idea of omni for maybe like starting out like off the bat, like as you're in like the exploratory phase, you're trying to figure out like what people like. Um, you get a coffee that is a little bit more flexible where you can do like a light, medium, and dark roast because one coffee, 3 offerings, and kind of like honing in on what your coffee consumer is liking.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so many ways, so many pros and cons, I guess, but it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, which is what Omni tries to do in some sense, like instead of adjusting the coffee, just adjust the way that you make it if you want it different. Like it's the difference maybe between this coffee is roasted. You can drink this as a drip, but we'd recommend it as this.
Yeah.
And drawing that line feels like, oh, I don't know if that's as beneficial for my business because I want all my customers to drink this. But then you've got this hurdle of not every customer is going to have the tools or wisdom to dial that coffee into that specific context. And so you're back to this decision of, can you create, can you make the decision for them so they don't have to do as much work to enjoy the coffee, I suppose.
Right. And I think we see that from like a wholesale perspective too, these conversations of, if a coffee tastes Actually, I should reframe that. We get this question a lot of, if a coffee tastes best on the fifth day or the ninth day. Like, let's say you want to brew your espresso between starting at day 7.
Hmm.
Should we hold back the coffee and then ship it to them so that it arrives on day 7? And, it's kind of like, well, you could do that, but one, it's gonna
Yeah.
take a while in transit. You are not deciding how long they hold it on the shelf after you ship it. And so really it's kind of like, you do the work to get that coffee to a consumer or a customer as fresh as possible, and you let them decide overall. But
Yeah.
but we're seeing more and more, like even on the side of bags, right? Is that like, here's the brewing recipe, here's the ratio of like how you should brew this coffee. So every bit helps.
A little bit of a guidance for people to say, we trust that you have the ability as an adult human being to make your own decisions what to do with this coffee. Here's some suggestions.
Yeah.
Here's what we taste. Here's what, we're offering this. We're not saying like you're just this, plebe because you decide to do it this way. But this is for what it's worth. And you
Yeah.
just reminded me of this. I was just doing a training, ironically, kind of close to you in Wisconsin. I was doing some barista training,
Yeah.
and one of the people being trained is also the chef, and we're talking about the avocado shelf and the aging of avocados.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of just that, you have an avocado shelf with different stages of development, and usually you just get an avocado shipped to you just hard as a rock. You're supposed to process this thing.
Yep.
But in New York City, I know that there's a service that basically is bike messenger delivery of ripe avocados to restaurants.
Whoa.
I forget the name of it, but I thought, of course. And you saying like we're going to ship this coffee, we're going to hold it back so it arrives to you ready at the ideal. Well, that's a very
Yeah.
boutique kind of way to do it.
Totally. And like, yeah, do you like run the risk of like, well, actually, I shouldn't say a risk because, they might find something too, like in that hard avocado to like extremely ripe, or 1 or 2 days off roast coffee to 12 days off roast, where they're like, I actually don't really like it really fresh. I
Yeah.
actually like it as it, as I sit with it for like 10 days. And, they kind of get to experience that change. And that kind of reminds me of some coffee from like Kenya and some coffee from Sulawesi, where Steve here at Mill City will like bring home a lot of coffee like that we just
Yeah.
roast out of the roastery. And I remember we had a Sulawesi one time, and he came in the next day and he was like, I think that coffee just needs a little bit more development. Like, I don't know what's wrong with it, like what's off about it, but it's just like a little vegetal. I was like, okay. And then he came in 3 days later and he was like, that coffee is off the chain. Like it really opened up after it sat for another 3 days. And it's, you kind of forget almost that it's like, okay, yes, coffee's agriculture, but then
Hmm.
after it's roasted, it's like, it's still doing like an agricultural process. Like your bananas ripen, your potatoes go bad. They grow roots. Coffee doesn't grow roots after it's roasted, but it changes over time.
Well, that's a really great point. It's also not just good to remember, but if you're going to become an expert in the product itself, you have to become an expert in the product after it's processed and what its life is going to potentially look like out in the world that it finds itself in once it's graduated from your roastery into somebody's cafe on their kitchen counter.
Yeah.
And back to those suggestions of like maybe you'll taste this or that or the other thing, or brew it this way potentially, because you've maybe at the roastery done the work to know that when you input these things, this output is desirable. So I kind of want to shift into this very specific idea. Since we've been talking about preferences and making decisions that are both business related as well as kind of the sensory experience of a customer, pre-blending green coffee
Yeah.
versus post-roast blending has been something that I know historically. I think I've worked for a lot of people who have done pre-blending of green,
Yeah.
and there was one time a long time ago it was all just like post-roast blended coffee. that was in the very early 2000s.
Yeah,
So, talk to us a little bit about what motivates people, maybe back and forth between one or the other, or start with pre-blending green. I
for
almost feel
sure.
like that's a new thing versus post roast.
Yeah, I think pre-blending, back when I started pre-blending, well, I should say when I first started roasting on like my first big machine. It was a 1990 Probat. We were kindred spirits. We shared a birth year. Very awesome. Not to date myself, but we were only doing post roast blending. And I didn't know why. It was just like, here's the profiles, do the thing, production roaster, that's your job.
Mm,
And, I was always curious about it because that thirst for knowledge, going back to that, I was reading and reading and post roast was always the common thing that popped up. And I can't remember where I stumbled across pre-blending, whether it was like a debate on Reddit or whether it was like a Facebook post, like whatever it was. And I just remember thinking like, like that would be nice if I didn't have to roast 2 to 3 different coffees, put it back in the cooling tray, then dump it back into buckets so that the person can bag it.
mm,
It would be really nice to get coffee out of the roaster that's finished and it can just go to packaging. And so, I started toying around with pre-blending and I did a blind tasting without anybody knowing. I just threw it on our like normal production table and, threw the post roast blend, threw the pre-blend on there. And my buyer at the time, she preferred the pre-blend over the post-blend. And it was just a good kind of like, that was the moment for me that was a little bit of like a light bulb where I was like, okay, so like there's some merit to this and there is a benefit to it. But, you know, with pre-blending, there's a couple of caveats, right? You think about cooking, and if you're baking potatoes, you don't want to cut up 5 different sizes of diced potatoes because those smaller potatoes are going to roast faster than the larger potatoes,
yeah.
to add a culinary metaphor in there. And when you do the same thing with beans, we had this experience with a customer that, they shipped us a pallet of Brazil and a pallet of Nicaragua. And, it was coffee they had sourced, they had already bought it. And, they shipped us their roasted coffee and they're saying, like, hey, please match this profile. I'm on a 1 kilo roaster. I cannot fulfill the 2,000 pounds that somebody ordered from me, but I want to fulfill this order. So we did it. But for me, I was like, well, let's see if we can profile this coffee as a pre blend. We kept trying and trying, maybe 2, 3, 4 iterations, and it just did not taste like their coffee.
Hmm.
We then did a post roast blend. We did another couple passes, and that just unlocked exactly what it was. And the reason being is that Brazil was maybe the size of like your pinky, and that Nicaragua was maybe the size of your thumbnail.
Yeah.
Drastically different size beans. So pre-blending, it's important to kind of find, like with like, if you can think of it that way. And if you kind of go down a filter of like tiers of what's important, there's kind of like tier 1, tier 2, like importancy, I think for pre-blending, that'll kind of give you like a starting like success point. And, that first tier is kind of like, what is the size of the bean?
Mm,
Are they going to roast well together? Are they going to take heat similarly because of their size? And then another thing that can really help is, elevation of the coffee. We kind of think of, higher elevation, longer time for cherries to ripen, more sugar inherently because of longer time to ripen. But lower elevation coffee, maybe a little less sugar, maybe a little softer bean, and they just take heat differently in the roaster. So if you find coffees that are a similar size with a similar elevation, that's kind of like a first step for like these coffees could work really well together in a pre-blend.
yeah. Okay. So that's the first one is appropriately enough elevation, top one,
Yeah.
and the size, and then you mentioned the density as a result of its altitude of growth, and imagine there's other things like moisture content. Is that like tier two?
Yeah, I would say like tier 2, like moisture, because those are I think those start getting into like the nitty gritty finer details of it, right? It's a little bit more micro than macro. Moisture will definitely like play a factor in the roast, but if you're just looking for success off the bat, like those two will kind of like get you in the wheelhouse of success. But, from there on, tier two, I think, processing method kind of falls in between one and two a bit because, you could take, what is it? I always kind of think like a natural Colombia versus like a natural Ethiopia. I kind of feel like a natural Ethiopia will take heat in a roaster a lot
Mm.
better than a natural Colombia will. And I think my theory is just more of like elevation and also maybe coffee varietal. So that processing method kind of wiggles in between tier one and two, but when it starts getting into maybe like think maybe fancier
Hmm.
processing methods like anaerobic or
Thermal
co-ferments,
shock and all that.
thermal
Yeah.
shock, yeah, like maybe those are like, oh, that actually bumps it up to tier one because those are like really intricate processes. That coffee is way more delicate and has a lot more inherent flavor about it just from what they did with that method.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I think natural, depending on just standard kind of like natural process historically, can kind of like ebb and flow from like, it's more important sometimes, but maybe not all the time. And that would probably lead you more towards kind of sensory analysis, like cupping after trying that coffee in a pre-blend because you just don't know
Yeah.
until you know it works or doesn't work sometimes.
Well, you mentioned that a couple of times here, and the idea of if something is working or not working. So what is that you're so you said it's not taking the heat as well.
Yeah.
And so you're making a judgment call on whether something is taking heat well or not well. Is that just based on what you expect from, history of the development times of your standard coffees where one is a little bit more high needs than the other one?
Yeah. I think the best comparison that I can kind of translate this to is like in steps of like natural Brazil, washed Colombia, like washed Ethiopia, in those kind of just like three coffees,
Hmm.
with like Brazil being maybe lower elevation, Colombia mid elevation, Ethiopia higher. And historically, Brazil will kind of, I feel like, take on heat a lot slower. It kind of reminds me of, if anybody remembers the kind of maybe fifth grade science class where they talk about molecules and like, it's like when you're really cold, you're bundled up and you're trying to keep all the heat trapped in. That's kind of like higher elevation coffee. Like, I'll take all the heat I can get. But when you're hot and you're spread out and you're like, ew, I don't want to take any heat on, I'm already hot enough. That's kind of like how Brazil reacts. It just lets heat like move through and it takes a
Mm.
little bit of a more stretched out roast, like a longer, like midsection of the roast to kind of work heat into the seed more efficiently.
Oh,
Yeah, that's kind of a method just generally for pre-blending as well, is just kind of like a little bit more of an elongated roast so heat makes its way a little bit more evenly throughout the entirety of the bean
yeah.
mass
So
in a
if you're going to
roaster.
pre-blend the green, you probably would have already had to have explored the various idiosyncrasies of this origin to know whether or not it matches well with another origin that you could probably pre-blend. So it wouldn't be like advisable to just get green in that you cupped by itself. You thought you liked the coffee, but then you're
Yeah.
like, all right, we're just gonna throw these together and thirds or whatever, and
Right.
hope it comes out good. You're gonna have to individually explore that green.
At first, I think the they're always an exception to a rule, right?
Mm.
You you can always like throw it together and fingers crossed, go with God, hope it works.
Yeah.
um, and best case scenario is that you're like, this tastes incredible, and then you start moving into like, well, why does it taste incredible? Like, what happened here? Like, what did I do?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely not. It's we fall into all of these accidentals, like this tastes incredible, and then we keep pulling that string as roasters, and until we kind of like develop this idea of like, oh, this is why it got to taste this great, and you kind of find those patterns. But going back to that small roaster where it's like, you sampled all these coffees, you brought it in, and maybe you're starting to profile them individually before tossing them together, that could be a little bit more beneficial.
Right, because then if you're thinking happy accidents are happening with this blend, what you're having is a moment of celebration, but you're almost intuitively you know that you don't have anything else in the chamber, kind of like a one hit wonder. You're
Yeah.
like, I did that. We wrote Eye of the Tiger, and now, and for fans, I guess I'm not saying they're a one hit wonder. I don't know, but the idea of if one harvest changes with your blend component, or if the bag itself is older that you're blending with versus when you first blended it,
Yeah.
you just won't know,
No.
and you couldn't replicate it, which is the very idea of what blends are supposed to be able to accommodate, right?
Right. And that's the constant game, right? It's like sourcing for like flavor consistency, but like the reality is things are aging. And that's a good thing that you brought up, is that, aging components as you're, tasting the blend. And this will happen to us pretty often. It'll happen maybe every like 3 months. Like we'll kind of bring our blend to the table. We don't cup every 3 months, we cup every week, the blend. But after we've been cupping it for like 3 months,
Yeah.
we'll start to notice like, oh, like the nuttiness in this blend is getting a little loud, and like the pep, the final twist of lemon at the end of that cocktail has kind of disappeared. And then we'd be like, okay, well, maybe the Ethiopia is fading and the Brazil is starting to get a little loud, or maybe it's that Peru in the middle. Like maybe that's dominating with its more like chocolate, like hearty character, like about it. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, I guess instead of doing all of these in equal ratios, 1-1-1, we're going to bump the Ethiopia higher to try and bring that character back in, and maybe drop the Brazil, and only by about like, that might turn into 30% Brazil and then 35-35 of the other two components. It's
Yes.
slight, yeah.
Okay.
And that's kind of how, we're tweaking the blend to maintain that flavor consistency while still kind of like using that inventory. But then that would also go back to, single origins too. That's like, well, maybe it's getting a little too nutty and it's losing some of like that toasted character, or like that molasses kind of character. Maybe we need to up the finish temp by 2 degrees to bring that
Okay.
back.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then with a post roast blend, though,
Yeah.
you now have the versatility option where this is a single origin that can be used across your wholesale customers, your cafes. So it's two products in one.
Yeah.
You're blending these things. It feels like there's an advantage there. Plus, you have the knowledge that you have roasted this coffee ideally, but then in the brewing process, coffees may or may not interact well together. So one coffee developed for its own sake
Yeah.
might not work well with another versus pre. I guess I would like to know what the advantage is. I was
For
just
sure.
kind of thinking out loud here about what the advantages of post roast blending versus pre blending.
Yeah. Yeah. Post roast, every bean, that idea when post roast was, the only thing out there. And it's still like an option in your arsenal, right? It's just a style or a tool for like how you want to create a blend or do a blend. But it does make sure that, yeah, every bean kind of gets its own special treatment. Like we have highlighted this seed to be the best possible version that we think out of our creativity as a roaster that it can be. So that's what we want to emphasize, right? The you know that does make sure like all of your single origins, right? It's like those are spot on. And I guess if your blend is developed in such a way where that extraction, that solubility is on and like consistent, it's like that's what we want overall, right?
Yeah.
Consistency between batch and batch, but it does create a little bit more work in that blending after the fact. And, luckily it's like, our cooling trays do the job for that on a
Yeah.
roaster, which is nice. But then, something I've always wanted to try, which I haven't done, is, I've had this idea of like, well, what is the optimal time that is needed in a cooling tray for all those coffees to like homogenize equally or to blend equally? Like, it'd be cool if it's three different coffees and they were all painted a different color and you blended it to see like when do they all kind of like mingle with each other?
Yeah.
Is it 1 minute? Is it 5 minutes? You know, that's a future me note,
I
but
like that. Next time any of you out there that are roasters accidentally drop green into your roasted coffee,
yeah.
you could try just don't do anything about it for a bit and get back to Bryant.
Yeah, just wait and see how long it actually like takes to blend in. But then we run into really dense coffee
Oh
or like
gosh.
really heavy coffee to lighter coffee because of its roasted character. Uh,
Never an easy answer. Good gosh.
Never an easy answer.
Well, I think it's also this assumption that if you are going for the versatility of providing a single origin option for all of your blend components, that you are proud of all of your blend components.
Yeah,
And there are a lot of people who buy blenders that they don't want to put out there as single origin. And
yeah,
I'm not saying it's right or wrong necessarily. I mean, it's an item that they say, every coffee has a home, but I don't know if every coffee necessarily is something a roaster wants to trumpet as a single origin because it works best as in a blend. So
yeah.
that's another thing right there.
That is, yeah, absolutely. And I think larger, this just goes back to now we're on the opposite side, larger roasteries,
Mm,
where I think, you have the infrastructure and the space and the ability to, you know, have those types of coffees where it's like, this is just our blender coffee. And, when you're working with, finite resources in a smaller warehouse, a smaller shed, like maybe a micro roastery operation, you're like, every square inch counts. And to that benefit, it's also, you're probably working with nicer coffees and giving yourself a larger bullseye too for, obtaining quality out of your roast,
yeah.
as opposed to like that one sweet spot or two sweet spots that like blender coffee may have. So there's a what is it? There's an ass for every seat, but there's a coffee for every person.
That's right. Yeah, and then there's some coffees that taste low. Well, anyway, uh, I think the question then becomes if you are a roaster, and most of the people I think listening to this show are in the small to mid to, let's say they have a they're scaled up roasteries, but they're not like Farmer Brothers or something like that. If they were going to choose between one or the other, I mean, first of all, do they have to choose between one or the other? Can they do both? And how would you recommend they decide between those? What's your piece of advice for people kind of on the fence about this?
For sure. Yeah, you absolutely do not have to stick with one or the other. Your craft is your own. As I always tell people when I'm setting people up with their roasters, it's like you're going to develop your own style like over time. And I could tell you when landmarks and events hit at what temperatures, but that doesn't help you because you're going to listen and see things and taste things a lot differently than I do. But
Mm,
what's helpful is that we can learn to communicate about how we're identifying things in the cup, in the roast. And I think for those blends, a really useful piece of advice would be, roasting those coffees individually, like to, let's say, you have this idea in mind of like, I just want a house blend that's good for everybody that comes through that door. They just want a 16 ounce and they just want to put cream and sugar in it. Great. I know that I might just need a medium or like a medium to dark kind of like house blend. Having coffees that, you know, emphasize body and sweetness and tasting them on their own. So that could be, something that's, a Sumatra, a Java, a Papua New Guinea, and like maybe a Colombia, Guatemala, and a Peru, something that has like, something Latin America and something that's like Indo-Pacific. And you're tasting them separately, just like cupping, like in a bowl. But what you can do is like, okay, well, I have these two coffees. They taste great as individually as a profile, but what if I took 2 spoonfuls of this coffee and like 1 spoonful of this,
Yeah.
a wet blend, as we say. We're always looking for a better name than that. And kind of getting an idea of like, well, what would that ratio kind of taste like together? And that ratio can kind of help you hone in on, well, are these coffees roasted individually working well together? And if so, maybe I'll do a blend with the beans I have left, brew it up in a batch or a cup, and see if it's still holding that character. And that's not a bad place to start. And then if you've got the whimsy in you, you could go ahead and do like, well, what if I just do a pre-blend of that percentage to a similar finish time and
Okay.
temperature in the roaster? Do I get the same quality, or is something diminished? And that can kind of start to tell you like, oh, I prefer one or the other. That's really kind of we don't know if it doesn't work until it doesn't work. And it's almost similar to just kind of roasting in general. Like you kind of find something that works and you kind of stick to the course, but then you might get something in that completely upheaves your world. And you're like, wait, this doesn't taste anything like the sample that made me purchase this coffee.
Yeah.
And you're just like, what am I doing? And you're beating your head against the wall trying to make the coffee work. And it's like, well, maybe it's just how you're approaching the roast that you have to change. So, I think post roast benefits people that are just getting into it. And for folks that are wondering if they can simplify or benefit from production times and, resources in your business by pre-blending and just getting stuff out faster, or a finished product out of the roaster faster, I should say, that's definitely an avenue that I think is maybe like, secondary
Yeah.
from post blending. But, the other side of it too is that, a lot of people I think are also, maybe starting to, sell greens like that are like pre-blends. So it's like, like we do that. And I know there's some other folks out there that do it as well, where it's like, here is something that is an espresso blend, or this is a holiday blend, where
Hmm.
like they've done the work for you to experience a pre-blend. Those are also kind of like worth exploring to decide like, oh yeah, like it can be done, to have that kind of like nudge and a reference
Yeah. Yeah.
to experience that.
I like that the constant throughout this and the starting point and the final judgment is start with whether it works,
Yeah.
whether the taste is there, if it's going to be able to be consistent and you're proud of it, it's doing what it should do, and the benefits that it gives you are secondary to the conversation around the quality of it. And you should, I guess, be warned off from discounting that flavor aspect in service of efficiency, because it feels like once you go down that road, you're it's hard to get back out.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like we're creatures of habit, like, right? We have our routines. I make the same dose and pot of coffee every morning. I eat the same breakfast every morning because I just know that it's going to take me this long to accomplish those things.
Yeah.
And it's like coffee, right? It's like, oh, I've always done this. It's always worked. Why should I change? Um,
Yeah.
and it's important to, allow that kind of like creative exploration, kind of like challenging kind of what you already know, I think is always important because there's something new every year. And I think if it moves the needle in your craft, then that's advice worth listening to, right? If it doesn't do much for you or there's aspects of it that like worked, then it's just something that, you kind of take and you keep building your own like expertise and method to the
Yeah,
process.
well said. Bryant, thank you so much for breaking this down and just sharing a little of your story and your perspectives on this. It's really helpful to clarify these questions.
Yeah.
And I would be curious to know where you would like people to interact with you and your brand at Relative Coffee.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, just at Relative Coffee Co. as the handle. You'll find my own links and handles there, but you can also find me at the Mill City Roasters channel for whether it's their Instagram on Reels cleaning venting, or YouTube doing roast-alongs or cuppings. And yeah, anything on those two channels, you can find me. Um, yeah, I'm pretty open book. Always happy to chat.
Well, it's excellent to have you here and chat on the show. Thanks, Bryant.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. So happy to be here and thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And of course, I would invite you to go to millcityroasters.com. And if you take any of their educational courses, you're going to be able to interact with Bryant's work. You're also going to want to taste Bryant's work at relativecoffeeco.com. And one of the things that really, again, at the end of this conversation sticks out to me is the idea that we're constantly going to have this balance between what is practical and effective and helpful for the roastery to operate without sacrificing the quality of the coffee experience. And as long as we don't lose our ability to pay attention to both of those things, the well-being of our people, the profitability of our roasteries, as well as the flavor of the coffee throughout all of our roasting efforts, then you're going to end up choosing something that works for you, whether it's post or pre, or maybe a combination of the two, because some places do both. Sometimes it just works that way. And like we said in this episode, what works means is something personal to you, but it's got to be consistent, and balance those different virtues and attributes that you value in your business. So big thank you to Bryant Banker-Scannell for being on this first of many Rate of Rise episodes for 2025. And a big thank you to Mill City Roasters for sponsoring our show. Check them out, millcityroasters.com. And with that, I will say goodbye. Check out the show notes because we've got a link to lots of different Rate of Rise episodes that are related to this, as well as other topics that we've covered on the show in the past to keep the conversation going. And I will see you here next time on another edition of Rate of Rise, from keys to the shop.